Okay, so good evening, I suppose, already, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our final panel of the day, which concerns the issues of quite a new narrative in foreign policy and foreign relations of both Ukraine and all the countries of the Central European region, and that is their relations with the Global South. And regional, or should I say mega-regional, because Global South is quite a vast array of countries throughout different geographical, political, and informational spheres. So let us, for this panel, call it a mega region of foreign relations. We do see a lot of complexity within this region. We do see a lot of misunderstanding or even, let's say, hostility towards Ukraine being an active part of communication with that region. But that's a problem not only for Ukraine, but also for all of the countries trying to rediscover Global South for themselves, for their security, for their economy, and for their political relations. And that is the main reason why today we are ought to speak about how can we as Central European nations, how can we as Ukraine, how can we as experts, politicians, and specialists approach the issues with Global South. And so our today's panelists are Omar Ashur, Professor of Security and Military Studies at Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Maybe some applause in order to show that you're alive still. Then we have Lukas Ivanauskas, Policy Analyst at Osmos. Also today representing to you Valentin Nicolescu, Professor of the Diplomatic Academy of Romania. And for the Ukrainian part of our wonderful panel, Olena Bordilovska, expert on Southeast Asia. And Olga Vorozhbit, journalist at Ukrainian Week or Ukrainski Tizhdень Journal. Please welcome. Our main goal is to encompass as wide a range of issues and questions as possible. And so let us start with Mr. Ashur. So you had a great number of lectures and presentations during the last weeks in Ukraine concerning your book and your new educational course on how did ISIS fight and how all the developments in the Middle East can affect Ukraine and other countries. What can we learn from that approach? And also you're a well-renowned expert, both within Ukrainian and international information sphere, on the rediscovering Middle East and Eastern countries, basically for, let's say, Western-leaning audience. So my question is as follows. How do you think, what is the best appropriate Ukrainian approach to the Middle East? How can we interest Middle Eastern countries in Ukraine? And to that extent, what is interesting for Middle Eastern countries concerning Ukraine, its experience, its resources, potential, etc., etc.?
Well, thank you. First, thank you for the very kind invitation. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. And second, you did not give me these questions in before, so now I'm not... anyway, I prepared something, but I'll tailor it to that. Well, there are multiple dimensions here. For the first, the issue of the Global South, I was more general. The definition, you made it easier for me because now it's just the Middle East. But for the Global South, it's just putting the analyst hat on. You always need to tailor the message. You find the right messenger, you find the right medium, but you need to know the audience. So, like the Global South, the Middle East is very complex. Countries in there have very different and conflicting policies, even if they are neighbors. Algeria and Morocco almost went to war. The UAE and Qatar almost went to war. And Egypt and Libya actually went to war. So things are very... This is away from the Arab-Israeli conflict by its own, which is part of it is ongoing right now. Okay. First, I will go to why. Why do we need the Middle East and the Global South? What does Ukraine needs to enhance its relationship with the Middle East and the Global South? Part of it, it's the diplomacy, right? This is like the Global South is about 78 countries, so almost 40% of the UN General Assembly votes. It has some of the richest countries are there, like Qatar and Kuwait, and some of the poorest countries are there, like the Central African Republic and Sudan, but they provide gold for Russia. So you need to also address this dimension. So they have resources in that sense, and that resources affect Ukraine in a direct way. So this is the other issue. The issue of resources brings us to the issue of the economics. Many countries, including in the Middle East, are basically holds for the sanctions regime against Russia. That's the most famous and the richest of which is the UAE, in terms of investments and trade holds for Russia. But also there is a dimension that has to do with the military dimension. I was writing a piece, an op-ed, on that particular question you asked me, but specifically on the ammunition stocks. We just talked about the defense industries in the West, and there are hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunitions plus the weapon systems, Soviet and post-Soviet produced, that are available in the Middle East and the larger global South. And we're talking all the way from Vietnam and Laos, all the way to Algeria and Morocco, and in between them. And these stocks, either Ukraine gets them or at least spoil it for Russia so that Russia does not get them. And hence you need these. And to be more specific, because I heard the question, I think there was a question by Ihor about the air defense. So just an example. So Ukraine will need air defense munition for systems like the S-300s, like the Buk M systems, and lower systems such as the Sterlas and the Iglas and others. The Western systems there's not many of them in terms of ammunition, in terms of also the production capacity. Maybe in 12 months there will be, but right now there isn't for the RSTs, for the NASAMs. The Patriots are very expensive, and as you know, so hence you will need for the air defense to get as much as fast as possible the munition stocks that are available elsewhere, but also a lot of them in the global South. So these are the whys. The hows, well, you need primarily let's put it this way: you either charm them or you give them money. So one of the two. So since the money is scarce, so you need to charm them, and the way to charm them is to have a good strategic communication policies. Ukraine and many countries in East Europe suffered from colonialism. Africa, and that's the story of Africa, the story of Latin America, and story of many parts of the Middle East. Suffered from this is a war of liberation. This is an anti-colonial war against a colonial power that just got away with what it colonized for a while. This is also a situation where you have multiple forced deportation. People are being extracted from, forcibly deported, which is also a story in the global South and parts of the Middle East. This is an area where you have an intense colonial settler activities. Over 500,000 and owning Crimea, plus the Donbass, plus colonial settlements in Mariupol and elsewhere. So the connection with what the global South suffered from historically and contemporary is pretty much there. So in terms of your strategic communication policy, this needs to be very well integrated and sustained. The other dimension is when you address some of it's a very sensitive region, the Middle East. Again, I mentioned the diversities between different countries, and there is a history between them. So the level of expertise in these about these countries and about these regions, and we can thank here the Catholic University because they have a Middle East program, or it's ongoing there. But it really needs to be a bit in depth, and do not. What I can say, do not ignore the expert advice and the advices of some of the specialists in the region, whether officials or unofficials. They can give a good feedback in terms of giving that, shall we say, formulating the strategic communication policies and the statements of the higher level officials. And this will fall a lot on the MFA on one side, especially the public diplomacy, but also on the International Cooperation Department in the Ministry of Defense. So these need again to get involved and get consulted on what is the better way in terms of approaching these countries.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Ashur. And you made a very valid point that Ukraine and both other countries of Central Europe and Eastern Europe, as it was previously called, should have a strategic narrative, strategic approach towards the global South countries. And that is why I will hop to Mr. Niculescu, because we all know that you have quite a decent academia background when it comes to narratives, when it comes to Central European political narratives, and also the populism in Central and Eastern Europe. So my question for you is as follows. What do you think, what should be the general, let's not get into peculiarities, but what would be the general approach for Central European nations and for Ukraine towards the global South? Maybe some crucial messages, points, narratives, etc.
Well, I love cats. Cats have this tendency to go up on the furniture and have a broader perspective on things. I try to have a broader perspective on things too. Fortunately, dear professor here touched several points that I was going to make, so it's a very fortunate moment that I actually coming to, let's say, develop some ideas presented earlier. First of all, I think strategically we need to ask ourselves two questions or look at two different aspects when we talk about this changing narrative in our region. First of all, the dynamics of the international system as a whole right now. I mean, let's step out of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict and look at the dynamics globally. And the very first thing that comes to mind is the accelerating competition between the Americans and the Chinese. Both of them, if we look at it, try to, let's say, address in their own specific manners and try to charm, more or less, the global South. If we look at it, we're returning slowly. I'm referring here to let's say, the German strategy regarding the relationship with China. We're returning slowly, apparently, to a Cold War bipolar worldview, let's say, in which the global South, as we call them now, formerly known as the Third World, post-colonial countries, as Professor said, are more or less the main battleground for both big actors there. On the one hand, the Western world, led by the US, but hopefully having in EU a different voice. And within the EU, the CEE plus Ukraine countries having another type of discourse. And on the other hand, the so-called axis of aggrieved, the aggrieved, led by China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and so on, which are technically saying that the current system is no longer satisfactory for their own, let's say, needs. Secondly, we need to look at the issues facing us as Central European countries and Ukraine. Our colleague from Poland, Jakub, in another panel, asked the question when discussing that minor conflict between Ukraine and Poland regarding transportation routes and things like that. Who are we? Why should we be even seen as a region? Well, we need to ask ourselves, and now I'm returning to what Professor said, not what divides us, because there are many things that could be seen as dividing us. But more, we need to take a look at more broader experiences, historical experiences that we really share with the global South. From Athens to Tallinn and from Bratislava to Kiev, more or less all of our countries have no imperial past, with few exceptions. We never wanted to conquer anyone, more or less. We were conquered, we were exploited. Our identities were shaped by various empires in the area, from the Russians to the Austro-Hungarians to the Ottomans. And so we do have the basis for a common identity and a common voice. And I think we need a common voice here. Secondly, given this particular experience that we all share, I think that we are also sharing similar needs. We all need security, we all need prosperity, goals, let's say, all needs. We all wish for security, prosperity, and peace. So I think we can craft a new, or a Central Eastern European and Ukrainian new narrative, if you like call it that, first within the EU, in order to pressure the EU to be more mindful of the real needs of the global South countries, and secondly, to shape our own kinds of interactions with those countries. Let me give you an example. And how can we do that? Two short examples. First of all, 1985 in Mexico was had taken place a devastating earthquake. The Ethiopian Red Cross sent a check of $5,000. Ethiopia being at the time the poorest country in the world. Why did they do that? Actually, because back in 1935, Mexico opposed the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. So it's a principle of mutuality and reciprocity that can be employed between our countries as a, let's say, conclusion of what I and Mr. Professor said earlier. Was saying we can have this principle, like we will never try to behave ourselves as countries in interacting with the global South countries as our oppressors interacted with us. So we're different. So that's why on this ground we can build a different voice. And the second example was like 2 or 3 weeks ago in Romania. We had some courses for African diplomats, and what transpired there during informal interactions and talks was that the Western countries, when they interact with them, are always placing themselves, even unconsciously, on a position of superiority, which is perceived by the African diplomats as, I don't know, not working. So the relationships is built upon distrust. Well, while we can, by finding this common voice, and that's how I will wrap it up for the moment, to try to base our all interactions with the global South on mutualism and on reciprocity, and on really embracing the other instead of rejecting the other, as nowadays is the principle of the international system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Niculescu. And I'll try to make some kind of a storytelling within my moderating this discussion, and that is why, coming from the general perspective of what is needed for the mega region of Global South, transcend into the main narrative for our region to Global South, let us spearhead to the particular case of Ukraine as it is of now in the eyes of Global South. And that is why I'd like to move the floor to Ms. Olena Bordilovska. You have a vast experience both in academia and in practical diplomacy, and you know what the look on the world is like. You perceived it firsthand, and basically after 21st of February 2022, the perception of the world changed drastically, not only for Ukrainians and the Westerners, but also for the inhabitants of Global South. So how does the Russian war against Ukraine reshaped the view of Global South on Ukraine and the world, and how it, let's call it, rediscovered the Global South as a focal point of interest for Western diplomacies?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. and it is not mentioned here. I don't know why. I'm working for the National Institute for Strategic Studies of Ukraine, and I'm really busy with this topic for the last year. And I would like to present my observation. I will try my best to make it short. About the Global South, what is wrong with the Global South for Ukraine, and what to do with this position. My first statement is that, as Valentin mentioned, now we can witness really severe competition for the new international order, and we can definitely see a new appearance of Global South, as you mentioned, after maybe decades of silence. And my estimation is that it was the war in Ukraine, Russian aggression, which became a catalyzer of this process. And my second estimation will be about the position and the strategy of Ukraine. The core principle here is that Ukraine needs partners and friends not only on the West, but throughout the world. And now I would like to list shortly what are the main issues within this Global South problem. The first one is definition itself. As it was mentioned already, sometimes it sounds outdated, and I do believe it is outdated because I would like just to remind you shortly that the origin of this term goes to 70s, 80s of the 20th century, when it was proposed by some left organization after the Vietnamese War, and then was coined with the so-called Willy Brandt report in 1980, when this Willy Brandt line has been proposed, and mapping was very interesting. Still, it was with the good intention to help the developing countries and to create a new economical order. At the same time, South Global became synonymous for what we know as non-alignment movement, and the core principle of non-alignment is neutrality. It is very important to mention here to understand the behavior of these nations. The second question here is what is wrong with Global South, and how we can estimate it now after the collapse of the USSR, when the Cold War finished, what to do right now when these countries became synonymous to J77, and we know again that they are still developing. They have a lot of complaints against West, and the main uniting principle here is everything is best, which is against the West, right? And these countries are still searching for the fairer position in the international affairs. But the problem here is that is it possible for them to speak by one voice? If yes, then how, where, and who will be this voice? And we can see that exactly this year, it was India who was appointed by the West to be the voice of Global South. We can see during the final G20 summit in Delhi, September this year, when the West really helped, they saved India with the final declaration, Delhi Declaration, because they really wanted India, who is one of the pillars of the Global South already, to be this voice, just to counter Chinese intention. Then the third question is, what is wrong with all these countries? First of all, it was mentioned, I just shortly repeat that it is a variety of nations. If we mention J77, now it is about 130 countries, which are very different, with political regimes, history, mentality, religion, economic development, whatever. They are very different, but mostly they keep neutral position again, as per the Russian-Ukrainian war. They actually never mention it like a war. They never said that it is aggression. They invented even a new term like Ukrainian crisis or Ukrainian conflict. They avoid to condemn Russia, and they never join the sanctions against Russia. So then what to do? And what is the Russian factor actually in this estimation? which is very important. And I think that when we come to the last question, the fourth one, what is the strategy of Ukraine and our Central European friends, among other friends, what to do, how to change this position? I think that first of all, we have to explain these countries what is going on, and it is not easy. And definitely I have some experience in organizing the events with our partners from Visegrad group, for example, in one of the countries of Global South. And this is the approach which works very well. We have to explain what is this war about? What is the problem in Russia-Ukraine relationship? What is the history of Ukraine? And we have to stop all these so-called peace plans, and we already stopped it, I hope, coming from this from the so-called Global South. Actually, no one likes this term, but no one proposed a better one, right? That's why in Ukraine we try to avoid this definition. We still have nations of Africa, Latin America, Asia, Middle East. So we have to explain why it is not just a distant war, as many of them estimate, and why actually these nations who are already affected badly by the Russian aggression have to take part in the discussions, how to stop it really. Not with this intention, just sit down, let's stop this war, let's negotiate, which is not possible right now because we have two different sides. One is aggressor and one is victim. And it's not possible to be at the same level. So we have to explain this. And finally, I would say that this year, Ukraine adopted already a new strategy which we were working on and advising a lot our authorities. And I would say that 2023 is, if not a game changer, but still a very good shift for better, because Ukraine started to explain these nations from Global South what is our war about and what is Ukraine peace formula is about, which is the most important thing to be mentioned. Because with this regard, we have already 3 meetings in Copenhagen, in Jeddah, and the last one in Malta, where nations from Global South have been invited for this discussion. I mean that right now we can avoid these peaceful initiatives which came previously from China, Indonesia, Brazil, and other countries. We are focused on our Ukrainian formula, peace formula, which was actually proposed in the Global South in Indonesia last year in the G20 summit in Bali. And right now, we have the only possible approach for these countries, which is if even countries like China, India, Brazil, Nigeria will join 2 or 3 points of this peace formula proposed by our president, it will be very good. And we already got some results. For example, country like India, they already said that they will support Ukraine with ecocide problems because environmental problems are very familiar for India. Or we have, for example, Cambodia, who said that, look, we have a huge experience in demining, and as Ukraine is the most mined country in the world right now, unfortunately, they will join us with this. The same with nuclear security, the same with food security, which is the meeting point for almost every nation from Global South. So that is the way when we already have some results and we have to go ahead, which is not easy actually, and that's why we really need our support from European countries, from our friends from Australia, Canada, United States, of course. We can do it together just to explain and just to struggle for truth, for justice, for law, which is not for the Western countries only. It is for the whole world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you very much. And continuing on with the Ukrainian topic, Ms. Burdilovska made a very strong point on the necessity to explain to the Global South countries what is Ukraine about, basically? What is Ukraine, why it is important for them to hear to Ukraine, bless you, and also to be familiar with our context. But unfortunately for us, we cannot start explaining what is Ukraine without additionally explain what is Russia. And unfortunately, without explaining our common Soviet heritage, which for many countries in the global south is a very familiar term, because many of them, as we all do know, perceive Russia through the lens of the Soviet Union helping poor and neglected. And that is why I'd like to transfer our discussion to Ms. Olga Vorozhbit. Olga, you have a lot of pieces written about Soviet heritage, Soviet perception, let's say, of Russia. And so what can we do with such perception in the global south? What are Ukrainian messages concerning the appreciation of Moscow help, let's call it that way, when it comes to Russian aggression against Ukraine?
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you for invitation. Well, frankly, for Ukraine, especially now, this is a really tricky question because from the one side, we are experiencing the decommunization and desovietization. But from the other perspective, when we talk to the countries of global south, to African countries, to Asian countries, namely to India, so our Soviet legacy is very important. Just one example, which I had in the discussion with an Indian activist, Kavita Krishna. So she mentioned me that her parents, they worked at the Bhilai steel plant in India. This is a huge steel plant. And there they got acquainted with the Ukrainians who were coming there as engineers to help to develop this plant. And actually, I remind myself that while studying at school, we read the novel by Olесь Honchara called Cathedral, and there is the huge part of that novel is about the Bhilai and how Ukrainian engineers are working there and communicating and cooperating with Indians, and how important this cooperation is. So this is just one example. So Ukrainian engineers, as well as other engineers from other countries that were parts of the Soviet Union, were coming to Africa, to Asia, so that to help the nations. And here, I think we need to, as a country, we need to stress this, that from the one side, yes, Soviet Union was oppressive for us. So I always stress this, like for my family. My father's family was deported from here to Siberia. But at the same time, Ukrainians still worked, and they were coming to these nations also, to these people, to help them develop their countries during the Soviet period. And you cannot say that Russia-India relations started in 1947 since the independence, because it was Soviet Union where Ukraine also was the part. So this is what I think we need to rethink in Ukraine, first of all, concerning this Soviet legacy. The other point which I would like to mention here is the history and the synergy in the approach. At the first panel, we talked about the synergy, and here Lviv is a very good city, I think, to talk about. Also for Ukraine and for our common Central European perspective. Firstly, because if we remind ourselves, people who opened so-called global clouds for Ukrainians at the start of the century, there were two, like Stepan Levinsky, the son of a famous Lviv architect, Ivan Levinsky, and Sofia Jablonska. So these people at that time, they traveled to East Africa, and Sofia Jablonska actually did the world travel and wrote about that. Stepan Levinsky was one of those who developed diplomatical representation of Ukrainians in East Asia. So this is why I'm mentioning him here. But the other story is very important. So when in 1940, Soviets deported from here people to Siberia, but then after the so-called Sikorsky-Maisky Pact, many of those people who were deported to Siberia went to Iran and then to India. And there is a so-called Balivade camp in Indian state of Maharashtra. This was the camp with the Polish, those Polish kids who were deported from the Siberia. But actually, they were not only Polish; they were kids from Lviv, Vilnius. So, and this story about Balivade camp become more known in Poland in 2019 when the deputy foreign minister came to Visegrad. They reminded this and started actually the Visegrad, the Kolhapur business forum there. So this historical, symbolical moment, which is very warmly remembered by Indians and Polish people who are coming there every year, so became the trigger to boost the cooperation. So I think we need, while communicating with the countries of Global South, our countries have to look for common synergy in the messages, and also in our history, which we have and we can share with them. I think on that I will finish my presentation, and then we can go on in the Q&A.
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Ms. Vorozhbit. And now let us finish the introductory part with Mr. Lukas Ivanauskas, whose organization, Osmos, and who himself has a great experience in dealing with African affairs, and especially, as your organization site told me, with Nigeria, for example. And we do see, and I can say it from my own experience when dealing with African experts, that Ukraine is misunderstood and misrepresented in Africa because of a lot of misinterpretation for cooperation with the West. And there is an interesting narrative, and I will not spoiler the speech of Mr. Ivanauskas, but there is an interesting narrative of cooperation between the Baltic states and Ukraine when it concerns the relations with Africa. So, Mr. Ivanauskas, please, the floor is yours.
I'm very honored. I'm very honored to be here as I think the sole representative of the Baltic countries. I hope that next time we will have more Baltic representatives here, as Baltics is a strange animal within Central Europe, but I believe we are part of the Central Europe, at least according to famous essay of Milan Kundera of Idea of Eastern Europe. So my organization has been working more on ICT sector, connecting on practical terms Baltics and Africa, and also facilitating more meaningful dialogue between and participation of Baltic countries in the EU-Africa relationships. Yet when the war, full-scale invasion started, as you know, Lithuanians are very strong supporters of Ukraine, so each organization and individuals try to do the best in their own capacities in order to support Ukraine towards the big victory. And we did small analysis of the narratives that were circulating and were very concerning within social media regarding Ukraine from the African influencers. So we tried to analyze and detect three most problematic narratives concerning Russia's aggression against Ukraine from the Baltic perspective. Why Baltic perspective is important? First of all, Baltics are new EU actors within EU-Africa relationship. We started more engaged with African countries last decade, but we are small. We do little things, but we have already the brand of developing new schemes, innovative schemes, how to do relationship with African countries from the very scratch. On the one side, on the other side, we are countries that understand the context of the region where we are now in Central Europe, and we have deep knowledge of that region. So these kinds of two synergies led us to talk and analyze those narratives from this perspective. And first narrative that has concerned us was that Russia never colonized Africa. As my colleague mentioned, this is quite problematic narrative, as our own experience shows very different side of the story, that we are still not capable, or we're still lacking sufficient means to talk not only with our global South partners, but also Westerners. We have stories to tell about Holodomor, about more than two centuries oppression from the Russia. That's a very different story than our African countries' experience. We have to admit that Soviet Union was supporter for African liberation movements, but we have a different story. We shouldn't reduce those discussions about blaming or saying who suffered more, or there it could be comparatively suffering, but we have to engage and have those conversations. And we have similar experience like Baltics, Ukraine, and Central and Eastern Europe. Another narrative is that Ukraine was portrayed as a playground of the NATO, EU, US vis-a-vis Russia. It's a very paradoxical narrative, I would say, because in a few decades, African leaders, intellectual, economic, political, constantly emphasized that they want to be treated as a subject of the international system. Yet in this case, they are trying to undermine Ukraine's own subjectivity and capability of being actors. So that's a quite paradoxical thing, but we can see this common ground that we, as Baltics and Central European countries, don't want to be a sphere of influence of Russia and other big powers. So the same is with African countries. And this is quite a temptation in Lithuania or Baltic countries to talk about Africa in terms of influence zones between Russia and China, US, EU. So this is how we need to be careful about our vocabulary and how we perceive the subjectivity. I would like to say my kudos to the Minister of Ukraine Foreign Affairs, Kuleba, who went to some African countries. He was portraying this discourse of equal partnership making that was, from our organization's perspectives, and also what African countries wanted how to be treated, was quite well designed vocabulary and discourse. And another narrative, thus, but not the least, this is whataboutism. Narrative was about that, look what our Western countries did in Libya, and why you didn't were so vocal on those violations of international law, or you didn't focus on African conflicts, and you do pay all the attention in Ukraine. This is like hypocrisy narrative that is becoming more and more acute, and emphasis being made in the context of Palestine and Israeli conflict. That Westerners are taking side of Israeli without mentioning or without emphasizing the obeying of international law that is most critical for such small countries as Baltics are, for whom the most important thing to survive in the international arena is to have the rules-based world order. And what can Baltics do in order to support Ukraine in this narrative discourse battle? We don't have resources. We are resources in terms of financial, embassies, diplomatic coverage. But how, as one of the small state theorists said, how do the small frogs fly, like small countries as Baltics, when they understand that they cannot fly? And what can they do? And one way how we can, as Baltics, can contribute to this fight is within our narratives and shaping the narratives. That is a soft power that led Baltics and small countries to punch above their weight. And one example could be we need to have those conversations directly with African partners on a political level, intellectual, expertic level. I would like that in my place would be African experts instead of myself, that just bridging these gaps, would be have those conversations that we already had in Brussels together, the Ukrainian representatives, Baltic representatives, EU representatives, Polish representatives. Those discussions are very meaningful and leading to those needed conversation. And we need to admit that it will be a long way. We will need a long term, but we have to work on this. And Baltic countries could be those countries that those engagements could be facilitated. For example, why not to have the Decolonize Russia conference in Tallinn, Riga, or Vilnius, inviting people experts from Baltics, Ukraine, Latin America, Africa, India, and have those conversations started. So that's my idea, and maybe next time we will have this kind of conference in the spirit of Sustainable Peace Manifesto. That could be the guidelines for our further conversations on so-called Global South, because they are not there in that manifesto, but there is direction if we want to talk about international order where nobody is excluded and feel comfortable within this area.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Ranauskas. And now let me stand within my liberal approach to this panel, and let's start first with the questions from the audience. So do we have microphones ready? Yes, please, Dmitro.
Thank you. First, there is a term which I like, not to use Global South, but another one, which is used by former Minister Klimkin, non-Western world. I think it's a better one. Second, I totally agree. It's a very good idea to cooperate Central European countries to join forces. Basically, we have the same problem. We are not known in those non-Western countries, in most of them. I remember impressions from talking to a Brazilian friend who said, in Brazil, Europe is Portugal, Spain, and several big Western European countries. All others, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Ukraine, all of them are virtually non-existent in understanding, in perception. And when people talk about, it's not even the biggest problem is not really the previous history of Russian Empire or Soviet Union. The biggest problem, biggest lack of understanding, conceptualizing, is the recent 2 decades or 3 decades. What happened after the Soviet Union dissolution, fall of communism, how it came that NATO expanded. Many people think that it was American decision to expand NATO, and that's it, basically. It's American imperialism growing. And many people who are sharing anti-American standpoint, they eager to buy this Russian narrative. Understanding that Russia is also not ideal, Russia is also perceived as a kind of having its own interest and cruel and so on and so forth. But by this anti-American narrative, which Russia promotes, Russia is very clever using these original feelings. So we need basically we have a joint common problem. We need to share our narrative, our agency. We need to reach out jointly. I think we all of us lack resources to do it, so we need to combine our forces. And I think both on the level of civil society and the level of the government. My biggest question to you all, but maybe specifically to Omar, I see really, the biggest problem, the biggest conflict in the world, which is most discussed, even last year, is not Ukraine-Russia. The biggest number of votings in the General Assembly of UN was not about Ukraine-Russia. It was about Israeli-Palestine. So this is the conflict where basically there is big dividing lines in the world. And right now we have, my perception is we have a really big problem in positioning for Ukraine, probably also for other European countries as well. And we have kind of expert discussions mostly, I think not really very much publicly, because publicly Ukrainians share very much solidarity with Israelis because the victims of the escalation attack by Hamas. It was kind of, it created a lot of associations with our own sufferings. So that created kind of the frame, and basically Ukrainians feel very much solidarity with the Israelis. But our Minister of Foreign Affairs declarations are more balanced, calling we support for two-state solution. We have diplomatic relationships with both countries, with Israel, with Palestine as well, and so on and so forth. But still, what's your suggestion? What's your opinion? What to do now? How to position Ukraine better in this huge debate, which is polarizing, which is dividing, and maybe also other Central European countries. I just saw in the news that President Zelensky was considering visiting Israel right now, but now it kind of postponed or delayed, I don't know, refused because of the leak to the press. What could it be a good idea now? Is it not really a good idea? Basically, your suggestion, what policy line to take? Thank you.
So, Mr. Ashur, please. Wow, I'm unlucky with the questions today, but that's a tough one. But okay, so the brief answer is stick to international law. Keep on condemning terrorism, and also occupation is a problem. So keep on addressing both sides. I know this will not make you very popular, but it will make you with one standard, without any accusations of double standard, and therefore try to undermine what Mr. Putin is doing right now, which is capitalizing immensely on such a conflict. The media is being more and more redirected to the Middle East. Despite that, it's not the biggest, like what you mentioned is, it is a long conflict, and it drawn in many sides, but it's not the biggest. The Syrian civil war had more victims than the entire Arab-Israeli conflict since 1948. Single civil war inside one country. So in terms of the lethality and the deaths, it's not the biggest conflict. But yeah, the international law, clear statements. Basically, there are two objectives there. One is not to lose audience in the Middle East, and two is not to make Russia capitalize too much, because it's already capitalizing by, one, taking away the media. Now you'll have a competition in terms of Western support with Israel, whether it's desired by any side or not, but it's a reality. We see it in Washington. And also, third is it's making, because of the statements that he has done, it's getting Russia some popularity there, which is also goes back to the we were the Soviet Union. Russia is the Soviet Union, not the 15 other countries. So it's reinforcing this misperception. And one thing that all I mentioned, it's great just to add to you, if I may, very briefly. The legacy is very clear. Legacy of Ukraine in the Middle East is very clear. I was interviewing some officers from the Iraqi army, from the Algerian army, and from the Egyptian army. All of them were trained in they're retired generals. All of them trained in the 70s and the 80s by Ukrainian officers, not by Russian officers. The last names were all Ukrainian. So just in terms of the supporting wars of reparations and post-colonial countries by the Soviet Union, the part of that was Ukraine, even on the military levels. So if you can add this as well to the narrative, that would be also great.
Great, thank you. Any other comments from the panel or suggestions?
Maybe I can add on this cooperation moment. As experts that have been trying to let Baltic cooperation happen on Africa, that is quite difficult work to do, even with those like-minded countries at Baltic side, can be perceived externally that they are like-minded and they are the same, but they are not. To persuade, to cooperate on very certain aspects, it's very difficult because it requires resources. And even within Baltics, there is differences between interest, engagement levels, maturity on certain countries. Yet, On the positive note, we had this year Baltic Africa Academy, where we gathered all like diplomats working on African matters and experts and civil servants from all Baltic countries, and they all agreed that focusing on narratives could be that interesting and really added value creating area for whole Baltics and cooperation. So this narrative battles is important, and it can create the area for cooperation and discussions for cooperation. But cooperation is a work that requires resources and planning, and you should be strategic. It's not you can say about cooperation, but when it comes to reality, it's quite a tough work to do.
Great. Thank you for addition, Mr. Nicolescu.
A short one. To your question, this is not a competition. It shouldn't be regarded as one between the Ukrainian war and what's happening down there in Gaza. And as Professor Omar said, it's not only respecting the law, but it's the essence of the international rule-based system right now that we shall respect the law. That is a very good point in favor of Ukraine, because Ukraine was invaded. Ukraine is asking for nothing else but to our borders to be respected as they were prior to the invasion. It was in your favor. Secondly, there are, again, within the UN system, there are many acts discussing the situation in Palestine and Israel. So, again, respecting the international order should not be an issue. And thirdly, I think that is a two-state solution, not a three-state solution. I mean, there is al Fatah too. Hamas, it's taken too much. This is not a media show. Shouldn't be like that. So again, think about that analytically and politically at the same time.
Great, thank you. Well, any more questions from the audience? Okay, then I'll take my liberty to ask a more practical one. We were talking a lot about the perception of both Ukraine and the perception of Global South as a political entity, but there is also a big trend, unfortunate for us, is the perception of Ukraine as a marionette of Western imperialism. And as you already mentioned, as Dmitro mentioned, I mean, a non-Western world perceives Ukraine as a tool of a Western world. And when speaking to American and British experts, for example, and also British partners of Ukraine, they were all saying, well, you should cooperate with Global South, but not in a way to include us. Because, as you know, it was told during one conference, a lot of African countries are speaking English. We'll not evaluate on which reason, but they do. So the perception of Ukraine as a partner of the so-called imperial states can play a harsh and a bad role for diplomacy, not only for Ukraine, but for all the countries who are cooperating together with, for example, Great Britain, France, United States, so forth. So my general question to all of you, maybe we'll have a digest of brief answers, for example. How can we address our cooperation with Global South at the same time remaining a partner and maybe an ally to the West? So how to balance these two narratives of foreign policy? The floor is yours. Who will volunteer? Please.
Yeah. Thank you. I can't give you a brief answer, but I'll just tell you a quick...
we still have some time, so...
brief example. So I had some conversation with some of the Algerian instructors in Qatar Military Academy. And part of the story is, and this is very famous in Algeria, is the same, like the allies of Ukraine, basically, the whole Ukraine conflict, the war on Ukraine is a CIA conspiracy, basically. So the CIA somehow trapped Putin here and somehow are trying to drag him. And then I had to emphasize a few things. First, I told them this, and the entire Algerian leadership of the War of Independence were French speakers, right or wrong. They said right, So basically, they did not speak Arabic; they spoke French, but they chose the identity. So identity is chosen. Okay, so that's one. Two, a little bit of history in terms. the NATO actually. Well, okay, so Ukraine had to give up its N-word, its nuclear weapons, in 1994 on basis of assurances of the United States and the UK and Russia, the aggressors. And it did that. It did that out of respect of whatever you call it, international cooperation, international security. And it did that. And of course, this was not, this did not help in later on. Okay. Now on the issue of Ukraine is they did not understand that the war started in 2014, and and in 2014, actually, some of the European leaders and the Obama administrations was advising Ukraine not to resist. And this was part of the reason there were no fighting in Crimea. Plan B in the summer of 2014 was the counteroffensive that was in part successful, liberated Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and it was a Ukraine. This was Plan B. This was against the allies. So that's just to put the history straight. And then fast forward. This is in terms of Ukraine's agency, and that this is actual war of independence, despite what the allies are, taking away the weapons, first the nukes, and then after that advising not to resist. So if there's a conspiracy, actually, if you want to have a conspiracy theory, then it would be against the West, not a CIA operation. So then, I'm not saying this, of course, but I'm saying that if you want to make up a conspiracy theory, then it's easier to make it on these misinterpretations of the facts. But then third, and most importantly, that was 2022. It was like a trap. Okay. So basically, in terms of the trap, you have the top soldier of the United States, the top Ukraine ally, saying that Kyiv is going to fall in 72 hours. That was a statement, right? Published by the media. So 72 hours. And then the advice was, Mr. President Zelensky, please flee either to Lviv here or somewhere in London or Washington. Okay, so then the leadership, the political leadership, decided to stay and to fight. The military leadership decided to stay and to fight. The Ukrainian people decided to fight. The babushkas in Brovary were giving the actual, locations of the Russian columns to be hit by the artillery when the Russian column is like 100 meters away. So the artillery is not that accurate. It can land on her house, if it gone wrong. So you decided to fight. Then the West started providing first the ATGMs, some of the ATGMs, some of the advanced ones, and then the armor, and then the air defenses, and so on and so forth. So it started advancing. So if you want to, if you give these facts, what conspiracy? The conspiracy was against Ukraine in a way. So you had to do, maybe you can do something, a recommendation for the conference, some myth busting for the about these, because these are realities. I'm not making this stuff up. It happened actually. So thank you, and sorry for the long answer.
Yes, thank you for the insightful idea. I think our next instrument that we'll create after the conference will definitely be something about myth-busting about Ukrainian Global South. Yes, Ms. Burilska.
If I may? Okay, I will follow Omar's attitude and maybe will give you some examples from my own experience. When the war started, I was in Pakistan, to be precise, and in the staff of our embassy. And what I can observe was exactly what you said, that, Ukraine is NATO's puppet and Russia has its own sphere of security. All these Russian narratives, I would not repeat all of them, And my short answer to your question is that everything is possible, especially in Global South. Why? Because Ukraine and West has been accused in so-called double standards. But sorry to say, many of Global South nations have their own double standards. And it is the case of Pakistan, for example, because they are absolutely anti-Western, anti-Israel, of course, and they are against NATO and everything. But when you go inside the home, and if you have a good relationship with the family, you will surprisingly understand that everyone has European, Canadian, American passport, just to be here.
Just in case.
Yes. Is it not a double standard, sorry to say? When the war started again, our embassy, the ambassador gave a huge press conference for the journalists, for media in Pakistan. They came, they put a lot of questions, and then what they immediately did after the conference, they just shifted to the Russian embassy to listen to their narratives. And let's remember that Russian diplomacy, Russian chambers of commerce, Russian intelligence networks, Russian cultural and pseudo-cultural organizations like Россотрудничество, they are all presented in every country, every nation of Global South. And they fueled this misunderstanding a lot, especially in the final stage of the war. But then, as it was mentioned, after our counter attacks made last year in Kherson and Kharkiv region, what happened? They started to re-estimate the war in Ukraine, in Pakistan, in India, what I can witness. They started to change the narratives from this pro-NATO, pro-Western, and not independent position of Ukraine. They said, look, Ukraine is fighting for the independence. It's really a war for justice, for law, and they can do it. Yes, Western countries supported them, but they can provide it. So, I mean, when the truth is coming, it's easier to explain. When the reality is changing in favor of Ukraine, it's easier again to explain what is going on. And one more thing which I mentioned in my speech. Yes, these countries, normally they are neutral as per Ukraine and Russia in this war. But neutrality is always the window for opportunities. Let's remember about it. Yes, they continue their cooperation with Russia, but they do understand who is the victim. And countries like India, even Pakistan, gave us some humanitarian support. It means they do understand what is going on. But in this, with this regard, we have to be very careful, as Lukasz said previously, in dealing with these countries. We have to explain what is going on step by step, but with all the respect to these countries, because they really have this neutral position, post-colonial feelings, and they are very proud nations. They have their own history, civilizational values, and other things which we should respect. And we should not demand something which is unreal. We have to create very rightful expectation. I mean, we should not ask them to abandon Russia immediately, because it is not possible for many countries, for many different reasons. Some of them are client states of Russia, some of them, like India, they are strategic partners with Russia, and so on. And we should not demand to change neutrality, because it is the core principle of the foreign policy of these countries. And Ukraine should not demand to change it. Please take a side. These countries never wanted to take a side. And that's why they were in non-alignment movement during the Cold War. And that's why right now they don't want another Cold War. They don't want to join any side. So we have to be very careful and give them a respect.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bordilowska. And, it was my malicious thought for a moment to ask, well, what do you think? Is the new Cold War started already? But it's a discussion for another 1.5 hours. So, yeah, Ms. Orzbit, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to continue a bit answering Mitro's question, but also continuing our discussion here. So, I'm a diligent student. I was a diligent student. And I think we have to be diligent in our work. Frankly, over the last 30 years, Ukraine as a state was not developing its relations with the countries of so-called Global South. So now we have pretty active diplomacy of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Africa. So, but just when I was preparing my research in the beginning of summer, so just think, Among the 19 African states with which Ukrainian president had conversations since the full-scale invasion, 9 conversations were for the first time in our history of diplomatic relations. So that says the story, and after the result we have. And frankly, after the first tourney of foreign minister, which was finished by his deputy foreign minister, we had the states of Africa, some of them changed their positions in the UN voting. So that means that we have to work with the small steps, with what we have, but for that, so that our steps were more stronger. That's why we have to have the synergy among the countries of the Central Eastern Europe, because Ukraine, one Lithuania, only Poland, we would not have so much capacity, but together we will. I mean, speaking together, looking for the mutual points, because this boost in cooperation, for example, in Africa, shows that it is indeed important. Also, I think different spheres, just also speaking in Lviv, at the beginning of this year, Ukrainian IT company from Lviv, Intellius, they opened their new office in India. And there are other Ukrainian companies that go on to Africa, Polish companies that invest in Africa, in Asia. So developing this cooperation, it will influence on understanding. So people-to-people contacts matter very much. And the other point concerning people-to-people contacts, we never paid much attention to the foreign students we have. Before the full-scale invasion, 70,000 foreign students were studying in Ukraine. 23,000 of them were from the states of Africa. 18,000 were just from India. And so they were coming each year. But we never worked a lot about creating alumni organizations for them, which was done by Russia. So actually, they have their alumni organizations, alumni meetings, and they take the students who were studying in Ukraine, in other countries of the former Soviet Union, and so on. So they organize themselves, they have contacts, and this influences on their position. So these, I think, these are small steps, but they are very important in changing. And as we see from the recent developments in positioning of African states, we can see results very, very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gles, Mr. Vasas, maybe your ideas?
No, not many, not those many, but I think we need to put, in the case of Ukraine, to put Ukraine on their mental maps. So first by charming them, as Professor Omar said, then by clearly not using any double standards in any kind of interaction. And thirdly, I think, appealing to their empathy with, what would you do if your country was attacked? Wouldn't you need help? Wouldn't you like that Ukraine would send you some grains, some, $5,000? Anything will help. So put yourself in our shoes. And then perhaps with small baby steps like that, and as she maybe slowly, not only Ukraine, but our countries too, because Romania, for example, had very good relationship with the so-called global South back in the communist era, and somehow we managed to, on the road of 30 and some years, to kind of lose that positive interaction with them. So we need to bring ourselves again on their mental maps as positive actors, not as sneaky, profiteering and double standard devious actors like Russia is.
Yes, thank you. And Mr. Noskas?
I wanted to support or seconded what Olga said about those people-to-people connections, because we need to understand that we will have a very long run in working with our partners on different level, on expert level, on political level, and those connections that are already there could help understand each other's standings for the very beginning. I wouldn't like saying that we need to persuade them, somehow bully them, support Ukraine for something. Just we need to have those conversations, have those platforms where those conversation has to begin, and support those people. For example, Patrick Labuda, a professor of international law with Polish origins, working a lot with African conflicts, organizing conferences, talking, writing academic articles, debating with African scholars on international law regarding those aspects. So we need more those kind of little actions that are very important. They are already going on in Lithuania. 1 year ago, Vice Minister Domėnas invited experts for the conference on small and medium democracies. Also, Lithuanian scholars are going to South Africa to having those conversations. So we need those small steps. And the last point, we need also remember, as Africa is not a country, so this global south is misleading. I don't know what word we need to have, but we should keep in mind that countries are very specific. For example, the Kenya's ambassador's speech at the UN on the eve of the full-scale invasion was brilliant, comparing their own experience of colonialism together with what Ukraine has suffered. Ghana, what else? Nigeria. Look how they are voting. So we have already some like-minded partners. So we need to be very specific on terms, vocabulary, and not to overgeneralize, because even the global south term is misleading in terms that we're trying to even take the agency of that region countries. And vocabulary is very, very important in daily based conversations. So I don't know which term we can replace, but we need to give the agency, as we also asking they respect our agency. And I don't have any advices for Ukraine, because who I am who can advise government of and Ukrainians what to do.
In relation to what you said, remember that dichotomies are poor analytical tools. They are reductionist and usually produce bad explanations. So using a global north and global south is a center-peripheric approach which helps no one. Neither the West nor the so-called global south. I guess we should, as Professor said earlier, we should perhaps discuss this on individual basis, or address them, with mutuality and respect, and not by bringing all together in a huge and empty signifier category that is actually perhaps for some even I don't know is not helping. Let's say.
Maybe if I may, one last remark about just question whether Baltic and African cooperation is south-south, north-south, or what else? So it doesn't apply. As well with Ukraine, where the Ukraine is. Is it north?
Let's just double check. Sergey, do we have another hour for this conversation? Unfortunately. Okay, so we're in a very precarious position, my friends, when we have 5 minutes left, so we can either have one small question from the audience, or we can have one small question from the moderator, or have some dull technical details about your transfer to a great dinner that awaits us and everything else. So, are there any small questions from the audience? For sure. Well, then I'll try to make my bigger question small. So, to cut a long story short, speaking about the Group 77 or Group 130, as it appears to be now, we are always getting ourselves stuck into Chinese issue, because China is getting itself out of its own place. Yeah, but I will ask it as a small question. So, speaking about Global South, let's call it right now as it is, do we need to start with China or not? So it's basically yes or no plus one sentence of comment. So, do we need to start with China when addressing Global South? Yes or no?
Yes, the short answer is because ideologically China has a revolutionary position, anti-systemic one, and also is apparently the voice of the exploited, of the former colonized people. So we need to address that. I mean, when a Western country, the EU, comes and offers, let's say, aid for development or projects or growing both sides and so on, they usually couple it with political and sometimes, I don't know, human rights requests and so on, which by China, which is decoupling this discourse from its economic investments, saying, oh, see, this is neocolonialism.
Yes.
They're trying to exploit you again. So, yes, we need to start with China.
Okay, one yes.
Yes, and I would say yes again because China paid a lot of attention and invested a lot of money into South-South cooperation. Look at the China-Africa relationship. This is a huge example. Unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, yes. And I would say once again that please try to avoid this Global South term, this definition as it was proposed. Non-Western countries sounds better because it is dividing. It is not uniting. It is again about dividing the world somehow, and we don't need it.
Okay, so 2 yes. Mr. Artur?
So I really agree with everything Professor Valentin and Professor Olena said, but on this one I will disagree. I think I would say no. China is very important critically. It shouldn't be prioritized, and I think the hold on the Global South is debatable in terms of like the investments in Africa and the way they saw how Chinese business is conducted. It's not very, very far away from 19th century, early 20th century colonialism. So the reaction, just give it some time and you'll see how much of a hold they will have. Yeah. Countries like Vietnam, which has a lot of Soviet ammunitions that I would like, Ukraine to have and Russia not to have, does not have very good relations with China. Other countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, others, they are very wary of the Chinese ambitions. So that portrayal that we have actually a hold over the so-called Global South between quotations, I would debate that assumption here.
Okay, thank you. So 2 yes, 1 no. Lucas?
Which China?
Wow, I like it. Well, for the reason of this discussion, People's Republic of China.
And the question, can you repeat? Because
should we
who are you? Who are we?
Like Ukraine, Central Europe.
Or as Lithuanian, no?
Let it be. As you said, Kundera includes Lithuania in this broader scale, so yes, let it be. So, yes. Yeah. No. So, Olha, your vote is decisive one, because 2 yes and 2 no.
Well, I will not hold in trick for a long time. I would support here fully what Omar said. So, because of Chinese colonialism, I would say that is.
So, in a close battle between the experts, we say that 3-2 in not starting with China when to address Global South and having a wider approach. But that does not count for a decisive vote because 3-2 is a very close one.
As Donald Trump would put it, it was rigged.
In a very Chinese manner, yeah. So we need to get rid of the experts who say yes, if we're concerned with China. Okay, so, dear guests, we are very diligent on our time, and I'd like to use the last 2 minutes for a small announcement. Please do not forget that on our official site, yutsev.info, we have a small survey for you, which will take approximately 5 minutes for all of you to fill in. This will really, really help our analytical work during and after this forum. And also, organizers warned me that I should tell you that our transfer to the dinner part of our great reception will be waiting for us in several minutes. And concluding, Thank you for our dear experts. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. And thank you for a very patient and very active audience.